By the autumn of 1944, along the hedgerows of Normandy and the shattered roads leading toward the German frontier, a new sound had begun to haunt the crews of the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, a deep, tearing roar that rolled across the sky before the world around them erupted into fire and shrapnel, and that sound belonged to a machine the Germans came to fear more than almost anything else in the Allied arsenal, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter so massive that German pilots nicknamed it Der Jabo, the fighter bomber, but so heavily armed that Panzer crews gave it a far more visceral reputation because tucked into its wings were 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 to a side, capable of throwing out a combined rate of fire that could saturate a target with more than 100 rounds per second, and when that storm of half-inch steel-cord bullets came down on a Panzer IV, or even the heavily armored Panther, it did not simply damage the tank, it dismantled it. And to understand why German tankers spoke of the Thunderbolt with a mixture of dread and grim respect, you have to understand what it was like to sit inside a steel box on a French or Belgian road, engine grinding, hatch cracked for air, and suddenly hear that unmistakable rising whine of a diving aircraft, because in that moment there was almost nothing a tank crew could do. The vehicle that had made them masters of the battlefield in 1940 and 1941 had become, by 1944, a coffin waiting to be opened from above. And the machine doing the opening was the P-47, a fighter originally designed as a high-altitude bomber escort, conceived by Alexander Kartveli and the engineers at Republic Aviation around the enormous Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp radial engine, a power plant so large that the aircraft built around it grew into the biggest, heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, earning it the nickname the Jug from American pilots, partly because its bulbous fuselage resembled a milk jug, and partly because it could absorb punishment that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. But it was not the size of the airframe that Panzer crews feared. It was the 8 guns buried in those thick wings because unlike the cannon-armed fighters of the Luftwaffe, which relied on a smaller number of larger caliber weapons, the Thunderbolt's designers had chosen quantity and volume. 8 50 caliber Brownings meant a fighter pilot did not need pinpoint accuracy to inflict devastating damage. He needed only to get his aircraft pointed generally in the right direction and hold the trigger, and the sheer density of fire this created meant that even a glancing pass could stitch a line of impacts across a vehicle's engine deck, its turret ring, its road wheels, or the thin-top armor that every tank of the era, German included, left dangerously exposed to attack from above. And this vulnerability was not an oversight. It was a calculated gamble by German tank designers who had built their vehicles to survive frontal engagements against other tanks and anti-tank guns, armoring the glacis plate and turret front with sloped steel, sometimes over 80 millimeters thick, on the Panther, but leaving the engine compartment, the turret roof, and the rear deck with armor sometimes less than 20 millimeters, because no one in the design bureaus of 1938 or 1939 had anticipated that within a few short years, the sky itself would become a battlefield from which enemy fighters could strafe a tank's weakest points with near impunity, and by the time the Allies broke out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, this gap between ground armor and air vulnerability had become one of the defining nightmares of the German war effort, because P-47 squadrons of the 9th Air Force, flying in close coordination with advancing American armored columns, developed a deadly rhythm of armed reconnaissance, roaming ahead of ground forces along the roads and rail lines that German units depended on for movement and resupply, And when they spotted a column of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, fuel trucks, anything moving in daylight, they rolled in from altitude, engines screaming, and unleashed those 8 guns in short, controlled bursts that could reduce a truck to a fireball in under 2 seconds and leave even armored vehicles smoking wrecks. And German tank crews, veterans of years of fighting on the Eastern Front, where Soviet aircraft, while numerous, rarely achieved this level of tactical coordination or firepower density, found themselves confronting an entirely different kind of war in the West, one where daylight movement itself became a form of Russian roulette. And this fear was not irrational or exaggerated, because the physics of what 850 caliber machine guns could do to a tank's exterior systems were brutally simple. The 50 caliber round, propelled at roughly 900 meters per second, carried enough kinetic energy to punch through several inches of aluminum, wood, and unhardened steel. And while it typically could not penetrate the frontal or side armor of a Panther or Tiger outright, it did not need to, because a sustained burst across the engine deck could rupture cooling lines, shatter fan assemblies, ignite fuel vapor, or sever electrical wiring that controlled the turret traverse and radio systems, and a burst across the turret roof could jam the hatch mechanisms, wound or kill the commander, who so often rode with his head exposed for better visibility, or detonate stored ammunition inside the turret bustle, turning the vehicle into an inferno from the inside. And German after-action reports and post-war interviews with surviving Panzer crewmen consistently described the psychological toll of this vulnerability as being just as damaging as the physical destruction, because a tank commander who spent years training to defeat enemy armor through superior optics, gun penetration tables, and tactical positioning now found that his greatest threat came from directly above, a threat his vehicle's own design had never been built to counter. And many German veterans later recalled that the mere sound of aircraft engines, even friendly ones, was enough to trigger an immediate scramble for cover, tanks pulling beneath tree lines, crews throwing camouflage netting over hulls in seconds, because the alternative was to sit exposed on open road and gamble that the aircraft passing overhead was not one of the roaming Jabos hunting for exactly this kind of target. And this fear reshaped German tactical doctrine in ways that rippled through the entire war effort, because movement that had once been conducted freely during daylight hours was now increasingly restricted to dawn, dusk, and full darkness, forcing German logistics and reinforcement columns into slower, more cautious patterns that cost precious time during a period when time was the one resource Germany could least afford to lose. And nowhere was this more starkly demonstrated than during the fighting around the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, when retreating German forces, including remnants of powerful panzer divisions that had fought the Allies to a standstill in the hedgerows, found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket with Allied fighter bombers, P-47s prominent among them, controlling the skies above, the only roads leading to escape, and the resulting destruction along those roads, later documented by Allied intelligence teams and war correspondents who walked among the wreckage, revealed columns of burned-out tanks, shattered trucks, and abandoned equipment stretching for miles, a graveyard of German armor created not primarily by ground combat, but by the relentless attention of aircraft circling overhead. And while historians have since debated the precise ratio of tanks destroyed by air attack versus those abandoned by crews who fled on foot after running out of fuel or ammunition, the psychological and operational impact was undeniable, because surviving German officers who escaped the pocket described the experience of moving through it as being hunted continuously, unable to find safety in numbers or armor thickness, aware that any moment of exposure on open ground could summon the thunderbolts down upon them. And this reputation was not built in a single battle, but accumulated over the course of the entire campaign in northwestern Europe, as P-47 groups like the 366th, 368th, and 405th Fighter Groups flew thousands of sorties in direct support of General Patton's Third Army and other advancing American forces, developing close working relationships with ground commanders through forward air controllers who could call in strikes on specific targets within minutes, a level of air-ground coordination that the Luftwaffe, increasingly starved of fuel and aircraft by 1944, simply could not match or counter, and German tank crews often noted with a kind of bitter professional respect that American pilots seemed to know the terrain and German unit dispositions almost as well as they did themselves, a testament to the aerial reconnaissance and intelligence networks that fed information to fighter squadrons before they ever took off, and interviews conducted after the war with former Wehrmacht tank commanders, though filtered through the passage of decades and the natural tendency to emphasize hardship, consistently returned to certain themes: the deafening volume of 8 guns firing simultaneously, a sound described as less like gunfire and more like tearing canvas, or a violent hailstorm striking metal, the speed with which a seemingly empty sky could produce a diving aircraft with almost no warning, and the specific terror of watching a Thunderbolt commit to a strafing run, nose dropping, wings leveling, the aircraft growing larger by the second as its pilot lined up the shot, because, unlike artillery, which announced itself with the distant thud of the gun before the shell arrived, an air attack often gave crews only seconds between detection and impact, seconds in which the difference between survival and death came down to whether the driver could throw the tank into reverse, whether the loader could seal the hatch, whether the vehicle happened to be near enough to tree cover to duck beneath the canopy before the guns opened up, and some crews developed almost superstitious rituals around aircraft spotting, assigning a dedicated crewman to scan the sky constantly, a role that, in the chaos and exhaustion of retreat, often meant the difference between a column that scattered in time and one that was caught, bunched together on open road. And it is worth remembering that the P-47 was never originally intended for this role at all, having entered service in 1942 primarily as a high-altitude escort fighter meant to protect American heavy bombers on their runs deep into occupied Europe, where its powerful engine and rugged airframe allowed it to dive after German interceptors from altitudes where lighter fighters struggled to operate effectively. And it was only as the war progressed, as drop tanks extended its range, and as the strategic situation shifted toward supporting the ground invasion, that the Thunderbolt found its true calling as a fighter bomber, carrying bombs and rockets in addition to its 8 guns, transforming from a bomber escort into what many historians consider the single most effective close air support aircraft of the European theater. And this transformation was not without cost, because flying low over German-held territory exposed Thunderbolt pilots to intense ground fire from flak batteries, machine guns, and even small arms fire from desperate infantry, and hundreds of American pilots were lost during these strafing and dive-bombing missions, their aircraft brought down not by German fighters, which by late 1944 were increasingly scarce and fuel-starved, but by the very ground targets they were sent to destroy, a sobering reminder that the fear ran in both directions even if the balance of destruction favored the attacker, and German engineers and tacticians did attempt to adapt to this new threat, increasing the number of anti-aircraft guns attached to armored columns, mounting additional machine guns on tank turrets for close-in defense against strafing aircraft, and experimenting with camouflage techniques designed to break up the silhouette of vehicles from above. But these measures could only partially offset the fundamental imbalance created by Allied air superiority, an imbalance that stemmed not from any single technological breakthrough, but from the broader collapse of German industrial capacity to produce fuel and aircraft in the numbers needed to contest the skies, a collapse accelerated by strategic bombing campaigns against oil refineries and aircraft factories that, by the autumn of 1944, had left the Luftwaffe a shadow of the force it had once been, meaning that German tank crews, advancing or retreating across France, Belgium, and eventually into Germany itself, could rarely count on friendly air cover to shield them from exactly the kind of attacks the Thunderbolt specialized in delivering. And this absence of aerial protection, more than any single design flaw in German tanks themselves, explains why the P-47's reputation grew to such fearsome proportions among Panzer crews, because it was not that German armor was inherently more vulnerable than Allied tanks to this style of attack. It was that German forces increasingly fought without the aerial cover needed to prevent such attacks from happening in the first place, and this dynamic reached its grim culmination during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, when initial poor weather-grounded Allied air power and allowed German panzer divisions to advance with a freedom of movement they had not enjoyed in months, briefly recreating the conditions of Fatemari. But when the skies cleared in the days following Christmas, Allied fighter bombers returned in overwhelming force, and P-47 squadrons flew mission after mission against the exposed German columns strung out along the narrow roads of the Ardennes, and the destruction that followed became one of the most vivid demonstrations of the Thunderbolt's lethality against armor, as German offensive momentum, already strained by fuel shortages, ground to a halt, partly because vehicles could no longer move safely even a few kilometers without risking annihilation from above. And surviving accounts from German soldiers who lived through this period described a growing sense of hopelessness as they watched vehicle after vehicle destroyed or abandoned along roadsides, victims not of Allied tanks or infantry, but of aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly, leaving behind burning wrecks and the acrid smell of aviation fuel and scorched metal. And it is important in telling this story to resist the temptation toward myth-making, because the P-47 was not an invincible weapon, and Panzer crews were not simply passive victims. Many German tanks survived strafing attacks with only minor damage. Many crews successfully evaded detection through skilled use of terrain and camouflage, and the overall attrition of German armor in the West resulted from a combination of factors including artillery, ground combat, mechanical breakdown, fuel shortages, and abandonment, not solely from air attack, but what cannot be disputed is the psychological weight the Thunderbolt carried among the men who crewed German tanks in the final year of the war, a weight recorded not through dramatic single quotations, but through the consistent pattern of caution, fear, and adaptation visible in German tactical documents, veteran memoirs, and the physical evidence of destroyed columns found across the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Germany. And by the war's end, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more combat sorties than any other American fighter of the conflict, a testament to its versatility and durability. But for the Panzer crews who faced it, its legacy was measured not in statistics, but in the memory of a sound overhead that meant the difference between life and death. A machine whose 8 guns turned the once dominant Panzer force into hunted prey across the very roads where German tanks had once seemed unstoppable, and in the end, the story of the P-47 and the German tank crews who feared it is not simply a story about one aircraft or one weapon system. It is a story about how quickly the balance of modern warfare can shift, how the machines that define one era of combat can become vulnerable in the next, and how the men who once rode inside steel fortresses of armor learned, in the skies above Normandy and the Ardennes, that no amount of steel could fully protect them from a war that had moved, quite literally, above their heads.